Welcome to part 3 of our 6-part debris monitoring training series. This series is designed to provide a high-quality overview of debris monitoring, no matter what your experience level may be. This training is provided by the Public Assistance Training and Development Branch. And here's a brief summary of part 3 before we begin. In this training, we're going to cover hazardous limbs, trees, and stumps, hazardous hanging limbs. We will have some hanging limb photo examples. We'll cover hazardous leaning trees. We'll touch on which leaning trees are potentially eligible and what documentation should be uploaded into Grants Manager. What other nuances of debris are there besides right-of-way removal? To start, we have stump removal, hanging limbs, and leaning trees. And before we begin today, let me just make a note. Per the memo on simplifying public assistance, FEMA is eliminating the size requirements for the eligibility of the removal of hazardous trees, limbs, branches, and stumps. Previously, applicants had to provide documentation showing the size of these hazards. This was to prove that they posed a threat. This requirement often slowed down the debris removal process. And now there are no size limits for hazardous tree removal, but applicants must still document the immediate threat with photos or videos. Now let's move forward into some examples. For our first example, we will be covering hazardous hanging limbs. And what does FEMA consider a hazardous limb? Generally, a hazardous limb is a broken limb or branch that is hanging over improved property or public use areas, like trains, sidewalks, or playgrounds. Basically, if it could fall and cause injury or damage improved property, it's hazardous. The photo that's currently on screen shows a church that qualifies for assistance under the eligibility rules established in 2018 for houses of worship. This particular church has hanging limbs that clearly pose a threat. Go ahead and take 5 seconds and see if you can pick out the reason or reasons why. If you said the tree crown is damaged and extends over the church's entrance, then you'd be correct. In this photo, we can see the hanging limbs posing an immediate threat to the church, and it prevents the church from holding services due to them covering the church's entrance. Some additional points here. FEMA does not fund the removal of broken limbs or branches located on private property unless the limb or branch extends over the public right-of-way, the limbs or branches pose an immediate threat, or the applicant removes the hazard from the public right-of-way without entering the private property. And before we move forward, we need to cover what an eligible repair here is. And that is always going to be the minimum cut necessary to remove the hazard. So again, back to the photo on the screen, you would cut the damaged branches at the closest main junction to the damage. You would absolutely not cut the branches off at the trunk. And now that we've covered that, let's move forward. This slide covers good examples of hanging limb photos. The first photo shows the threat to public property as the limb hangs over the road. And the photo also shows a red circle around the hanging limb. The photo on the right shows the cut limb and the diameter of the limb, which is no longer a requirement. As I just stated, gathering measurements may delay debris removal operations and are confusing in many disasters where size of vegetative debris is not a proper way to evaluate the threats to life, health, safety, or property. That being said, FEMA still requires that applicants retain and, when requested, provide documentation supporting the specifics of the immediate threat with the location and photograph or video documentation. Applicants must also ensure that any cost claimed are reasonable based on the work required to remove the debris. Returning to our example photos of hanging limbs, the last slide was good photo examples. And from looking at these two photos, I think we can see that these are bad examples. The first photo looks to be a low-resolution, granulated picture of nothing but the sky above us. But honestly, who knows what's in that photo? And the second photo, although it's better than the first because it actually contains a tree, still fails to show us if the limbs are a hazard to people or a threat to improved property. So your takeaway from these photos should be to make sure that your photos include the hanging limbs, make sure your photos show that the hanging limbs pose a threat to safety or improved property, The photo should not be taken close to hanging limbs. Why? This poses a threat to you. So back away from the tree and show the whole story. The story being, these are the hanging limbs that are posing a threat to these facilities. Basically, you want the reviewers to be able to see the photos you've attached and to immediately be able to identify the hanging limbs and for them to be able to see the danger they pose if the hanging limbs aren't removed. Now that we've reviewed these bad examples, let's move on to some more examples. Now, do these photos look better to you or worse? Let's go ahead and look at the first picture here. Does this photo tell the whole story of the damage? What about the second photo? Can you look at these photos and without hesitation tell me that there are hanging limbs posing a threat to public safety or improved property? No, you can't. The first photo is of trees, and maybe there are some broken limbs, but it's really too dark to tell. And the second photo is just a road. If there are hanging limbs in this photo, they're too far away to be seen. Now, these were some really good examples of the types of photos we've all seen and probably taken of damages at some point. Sometimes we snap a picture in the field, and it looks great. Then when you make it back to the office, you realize that the photo is a lot smaller and the details are no longer as visible in it as they were when you were on site. At that point, you just have to hope you took more pictures than that one. So a tip here, multiple pictures. How do you avoid this happening though? Just look at the photos on your phone after you take them. Don't zoom in. Just view them as they appear in your phone, turned in landscape orientation. This is going to give you a general preview of what they're going to look like after you insert them into a photo page. So now we've moved on from hanging branches and we're talking about leaning trees. And the three big things to remember for leaning trees, often just referred to as leaners. Number one, does the trunk have a split? 2, is the canopy broken? And 3, is the tree leaning? If you answer no to all three of these things, then the tree is not considered hazardous. But if you answer yes to any one of them, then the tree is considered a hazard. Some additional things to look out for here. Root balls. For trees with 50% or more of the root ball exposed, removal of the tree, the root ball, and then the refilling of the root ball hole are all eligible. And for contracted removal of a tree and root ball, FEMA will not reimburse 2 separate unit costs to remove the tree and its root ball. Removal needs to be completed as 1 unit. For trees that have less than 50% of the root ball exposed, FEMA only provides PA funding to flush cut the tree trunk at ground level and dispose of the tree's cut portion based on volume or weight. Grinding the residual trunk after cutting the tree is not eligible. Now that we've covered the basics of leaning trees, let's get into some example photos. And here we have 2 photos of leaning trees. Both are obviously leaning, but one is eligible and one is not. Go ahead and take 5 seconds to review the photos and decide which one of these trees is not eligible and why. Alright, time is up, and if you said the first photo is not eligible, you'd be correct. The tree in this photo is leaning away from the improved property. And as you can tell from the photo, if this tree falls, it just lands on the ground. But in the second photo, if the tree falls, it's a very bad day for the road, the power lines, and anyone that may be passing through that area when it comes down. Now that we've covered the basic eligibility info and saw a few examples of hazardous leaning trees, what documentation should be uploaded into Grants Manager? To answer this, let me start by saying the applicant must retain and provide, when requested, all of the following documentation to support the eligibility of hanging limbs and leaning trees. The first set of documentation required is the specifics of the immediate threat with the location, the GPS coordinates in latitude and longitude, photographs or video documentation that establish this item is on public property. Next, the quantity of debris that's removed. And a note on that, if a contractor charges an individual price for each limb, tree, or stump removed, FEMA will require the diameter of each item removed. For trees, it must be 4 1/2 feet up from the ground. This circumvents what I said earlier about the debris size not coming into play because this is used for quantification. If you look at the second photo, you'll see all the information listed as needed. We have a street address, a GPS reading, 19-inch tree trunk. I would probably add the dimension in this case, which is the diameter, and last, which was the operation being completed, tree removal. Last on this list, when filling in a root ball hole, FEMA requires a quantity, a location, and the source of the material that was used to fill in the hole, as well as the equipment used to perform the work. Now we're moving into fraud risk reduction information, and the best way for us to cover that is to direct you to another video which can be found on YouTube at this address. You can also just go to YouTube and search fraud risk profile, and the thumbnail will look like the one in the bottom corner on this slide.
Now we have some closing information for you. To report corruption, waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and/or misconduct, contact the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Inspector General, by phone at 1-800-323-8603 or via the mailing address listed on the screen now. Procurement requirements are among the most complicated parts of the PA grant process, and noncompliance can result in de-obligation of funding. Please make sure that you are following FEMA's procurement guidance for recipients and subrecipients. Federal requirements for procurement and contracting are described in 2 CFR Part 200. The Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, or PDAT, offers some training and tools on their website at www.fema.gov/grants/procurement. For technical assistance with Grants Portal or Grants Manager, you can call the PA Grants Portal Grants Manager hotline at 866-337-8448. National hours of operation are 8 a.m. through 6 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. The hotline can also be reached by email at FEMA-recovery-PA-grants@fema.dhs.gov. We have many other recorded webinars and tutorial videos available on our YouTube channel. You can find them by searching for FEMA Grants Portal on YouTube or by navigating to the Support Center in Grants Portal or Grants Manager. Thank you for watching.